I'm really glad to be here. Welcome to this panel of the National Forum on Anti-Asian Racism. And I'm Jennifer Simpson. I'm glad to be facilitating this panel. I'll start with just an acknowledgement of the territory that I live and work in and kind of my positioning within that. So I work and live within the Dish with One Spoon territory. And in that territory, I do my best to carry out my professional responsibilities and indeed engage with the world with attention to power and positionality and ethical relationality. And I certainly understand my role within the context of higher education and as provost at Ryerson as having a responsibility to naming what is wrong and imagining a different set of possibilities for both relationships and institutions. And certainly this panel is really connected to those priorities and that way of orienting myself. I'll give some introductions of the panel. Each of the panelists will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we hope to have at least a half an hour or maybe more for Q&A. So this panel, the focus is on the ways in which leaders, particularly at higher levels, deans and provosts, might be responsible for equity and responsive to the equity priorities. I'm really glad to be joined by my co-panelists. Those are Gaaya Srimarthandan and Sunwoo Baik, both of whom are students. And we'll hear longer introductions once each of the panelists speak, and they'll give you a bit more information. I'm also glad to be joined today by Dr. Verna St. Denis from the University of Saskatchewan. And Dr. St. Denis and I have worked together for about 10 years, so I'm really pleased to that we're in this panel together. And I'm also very glad to be joined by Dean Pam Sugerman. And it's been a pleasure to work with you, Dean Sugerman, over the last 4 months since my start at Ryerson. So it's just great I'm kind of excited about the conversation and what I can learn and hear from my colleagues today. I want to thank, before we dive in, I really want to thank Gabriel Cuifo and Joselle Gerardo, who I know have done like enormous amounts of work on this forum. And I'll also note that I started as provost at Ryerson on July 1st. So I'm really at the beginning of what I hope is a significant amount of substantive change related to equity and academic priorities. And that's why this topic is really important and exciting to me, is what are the responsibilities of leaders towards that change, and how can we hold leaders, myself and others, accountable to those priorities. Each speaker will have about 5 to 7 minutes to respond to the panel focus and 4 themes: leaders' responsibilities in universities and to public life, the forms of support that leaders can offer around equity, approaches to systemic change, and strategies for students and faculty in relation to leadership. And the panelists have been invited to kind of pick one of those themes, to focus on the description, to focus on all of those themes. So there's some space for how each of the panelists wants to enter the topic. And so we'll start with Gaaya. Gaaya, please.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for introducing the panel and your lovely introduction. So yeah, my name is Gaaya. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a third-year language and intercultural relations student at X University. To get right in the context of ongoing and systemic forms of racism and colonialism, I think it's imperative that we recognize what responsibility university leaders possess and how we must hold them accountable to it despite what role we hold individually in the institution. Are these responsibilities primarily within the university, or do they extend to public life more generally? A lot of the responsibility lies on university leaders to pioneer spaces and ladders for marginalized groups and individuals, and to use these spaces to amplify their voices and ensure it's not only heard, but also accounted for in all university decisions. They should also accept that the nature of the academy is constantly developing. There's always going to be new developments and things to look into, and that we need to constantly adapt, innovate, and progress at that rate, or even excel at that rate rather than dismiss it. That being said, university leaders should prioritize creating leaders who will do exactly this, and to give space to those people in these higher roles of the Institute. They should also encourage research, ethical research that honors the stories and true history of colonialism, and efforts in subjects like anti-racism and anti-colonialism to make knowledge that is accessible to all. That should be the role of a leader at the bare minimum, to challenge the system and dismantle it from within. But I also think responsibility is a very nuanced term, for it's an innate responsibility as a member of any society, any individual, and any institution at any capacity to prioritize social justice in all of their efforts. It's the minimum expectation we should possess for ourselves, our peers, and members of authority alike. And when we do not see these values being upheld, we should hold them accountable for it and call them in, even if it's to ourselves. That being said, it's not enough to just create spaces. I'm currently a third-year student, and I hope to pursue a master's degree when I graduate. So I've been looking into other universities, looking into what they're researching, and also especially looking into their faculty members to see what kind of environment I'll be putting myself in. I also look into things like the requirements, the personal statements, the GPAs, and everything that they're looking for in that sense as well. And you know what I've noticed? The hard dispelling truth is that academia is geared towards a very certain prototype, and that I hardly see people like myself reflected in these positions of authority and decision making that then creates what becomes of academia for future generations. The very hard, inconceivable truth is that we still lack to see representation, even in some of the finest universities in the nation that fruitlessly proclaim that they're fighting anti-racism and anti-colonialism, while still reserving these spaces for privileged and powerful groups in our society. Although it seems so little and irrelevant, this directly impacts what kind of space we're creating for our students. Students just like me and Sonu, and perhaps you who's listening, and perhaps some other viewers tuning into this session. I often hear of my peers feeling fatigued, tired, and discouraged from pursuing education because it all seems so in vain, when everything about pursuing higher education seems so implicitly biased, but painfully without even saying so. I hear more often about students feeling intimidated by the leaders in their institution than they do feel safe. I hear more about how students feel dismissed by the leaders in their institution than they feel heard. I even hear about students who feel disgusted that they're forced to take general courses, scripted intricately through mainstream history that mask the genuine stories of those oppressed and intentionally furthers an agenda, and not courses pertaining to Asian or Indigenous or other BIPOC and LGBTQ2 plus matters, because they're never offered. They're not prioritized. So how can we continue this? How can we sustain what we're doing right now in this session, in this forum on the grounds of solidarity, and bringing anti-colonialism and anti-racism into our daily lives if we do not actively give students and staff alike the space and position and roles to actually sustain it? I think the last thing any student or individual alike wants is a performative symbol of anti-racism, anti-colonialism to dismiss the genuine neglect that some institutions have. The only thing any student or individual wants is for the institutions to have leaders who will shape and sustain the progress that we're making through means like this forum. So what are some practical solutions? Well, academia, the institution, everything on these grounds, whether it's the literal physical land that we are on or the people who possess this land with the role at this institution, was all at the expense of colonialism and racism and the emotional and generational labor that many marginalized groups were exploited for. There's nothing we can do to compensate for this, but I think the bare minimum that we could do is create spaces that are anti-colonial, teach a diverse variety of courses, and encourage students to partake in them. Instead of just Canadian history being a prerequisite, teach them Indigenous history taught by Indigenous faculty with that story prioritized. Instead of just French being a language offered, teach them, I don't know, Chinese, Vietnamese, Hindi, Punjabi, Mohawk, really any language straying away from the dependency that we have on the colonialism and racism and the roots of this institution. And I think acknowledging this is the first step towards solidarity. And for students, as a student leader myself, I encourage you to not back down. Your fight is worth it. Speak up and keep speaking louder every time you're dismissed or shot down. And for university leaders, please listen, please hear us, and please take our words seriously every time you take a seat in your office. It's us that you represent. And hold our words to your heart. And that being said, I'm incredibly grateful today to not only be participating in a forum geared towards bringing these issues to light, but to be sitting alongside excellent leaders who care to hear out the concerns of their students on this panel. With that, I'll pass it back to Dr. Simpson.
Thank you, Gaaya. It's excellent, really great. Sun Woo, please.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm Sun Woo. I I guess I still consider myself a student, definitely, but I graduated in July from Simon Fraser University. I studied English and publishing there. And I guess I'm coming from a student's perspective, so I'll speak to things that students like myself and my peers faced during our time at university. So I guess I'll start off with the question that I'm addressing. It's in the context of ongoing and systemic forms of racism and colonialism, what are the responsibilities of university leaders? Are these responsibilities primarily within the university, or do they extend to public life more generally? So I think one of the most important responsibilities of university leaders is to be tuned in to what students are saying they actually need. And I found that in my experience and in a lot of my peers' experience, a lot of the time, the actions that university leaders can take to address a lot of these problems that we face are things that don't seem like they actually have anything to do with anti-racism or decolonization, at least not on the surface, or they aren't the most fashionable ways to address it. Examples would be doing everything in your power to lower tuition or increasing financial supports for racialized students and international students specifically. These things are things that are often thought of as kind of separate from the more fashionable or louder or catchier social justice kind of movements that universities take part in, but they're nonetheless very, very tied together. Another thing that university leaders could do is shifting the way that university faculty are evaluated and or hired to emphasize the importance of community building and culturally humble teaching abilities in their role as faculty of the university. So I guess in other words, it's shifting what the role of professor means for students and for the university writ large. Another thing could be doing everything in your power to resist the privatization and corporatization of universities. As we're well aware by this point, this phenomenon of kind of economic productivity being considered paramount and the continued undervaluation and underfunding of the arts and humanities are products of colonialism and white supremacy just as much as any high-profile, spectacular incidents of racism are. And as for whether these responsibilities should stay within the university or extend beyond it, I think they should definitely extend beyond it. And I want to take a moment here to kind of address the way the question was structured as well, because I think in setting up that distinction between what is within the university and beyond it, it kind of assumes that the university is or can stand separate or even above public life in general. And I think that's very problematic and part of the structures that we are kind of striving to break down with forums like these. And in that vein, in extending beyond the university, I think one huge barrier to extending beyond the university, and actually a barrier to communication within the university as well, is institutional language. The kinds of words and the ways of speaking, and a lot of the time, the inappropriate and frankly dehumanizing euphemisms used in institutional communication can be extremely alienating to people inside and outside the university. And I think there should be a huge push for ranking members of universities, especially, to change the way they write and speak in order to lower those barriers. And finally, as discussed in a previous panel, I believe it was Plenary Panel 2, they discussed, students and faculty members discussed the abolishment of the university as it currently stands, because we're talking about an immensely powerful institution that actively gatekeeps knowledge and power from racialized people, whether they make it into the university structure as students or faculty, or whether they are actually physically excluded. You can see this in the way that, of course, this question was structured, as there's a tacit belief that the university stands kind of separate from general public life. I think university leaders must do their best to open up the university and try to radically rethink who can and deserves to be present in our spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunwoo, for those insightful comments. And we'll go to Verna, St. Denis now. Brenda, I can't hear you.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, Jennifer. I come to this conversation from the perspective of an Indigenous woman, a member of Beardy's Okanagan First Nations in Saskatchewan, and from a childhood experience of growing up as a non-status and Métis born on road allowance. So basically what that means is that I was born on the margins of, basically physically on the margins of a road. So spatially and psychically. I also gained access to a university education through the Indian Teacher Education Program, which is an equity or affirmative action avenue into the university. Currently, I am a professor of education and also special advisor, a new position, special advisor to the president on anti-racism and anti-oppression. And as part of that role, a part-time role, short-term part-time role, I'm also just embarking on providing a little bit of professional development for school leaders on anti-racism. And so just to back up again in terms of where I come from, in the winter of 1993, as an untenured tenure track faculty member with a master's degree and a letter of appointment that stated that in order to apply for tenure and promotion, I needed in the meantime to obtain a PhD. It was a demanding journey, and I'm glad that I survived it and have had the opportunity these past 3 decades to participate in university life. Before embarking on my 3-year leave to fulfill the residency requirements for my PhD, I developed the first required, let's say, an undergraduate teacher education, social justice education course. It was tough slogging for those I left behind to teach the course, to primarily white identified students who were not prepared to have their cherished beliefs challenged, particularly their profound investment in the belief of meritocracy. And so upon my return, I encountered similar challenges, and I've published on some of those challenges. So drawing on those experiences, particularly from a College of Education perspective, and a profession that impacts all Canadian citizens, as public education requires mandatory attendance, I have witnessed the importance and shortcomings of university education that fails to take seriously the experiences of racialized people and Indigenous people in this country. Speaking from a faculty of education location, we need to address racism directly, not subsumed under a culturally responsive, culturally relevant framework. So often examining the cultural diversity of our students and citizens serves as a decoy from examining the history of white racism and is too often used as a strategy to avoid examining the embeddedness of whiteness in higher education. Many social and racial justice scholars have written about, quote, the self-protecting ignorance of dominant institutions and those who people them, who have built around itself an entire system of resistances. And that's certainly what I've encountered in my role as faculty over these past 3 decades. Basically, a refusal to examine racism in themselves and in our institutions. So over the decades, being met with a incredulous, you mean there's racism? So it serves to, undermine your experience and your reality. I've noticed that too often as well, too much focus is put on appearance, on looking or appearing to be doing the right thing. And that strategy simply doesn't work. Perhaps the PR efforts are effective for the broader public, but not for those of us inside the academy. A focus on appearance actually works to undermine the concerns and issues raised by Indigenous, Brown and Black scholars and students. Other scholars have also noted how we in the academy we struggle to name racism and to act against it within the university. And in more recent times, ideas of equity and diversity and inclusion have become a way, the preferred way to addressing racial inequality, and yet serves as another mechanism of avoidance. Or the emphasis is put on strategies of celebration rather than promoting institutional change. And so we need leaders, and here I'm drawing on some of the literature that informs my current research project, in which I'm examining how school leaders narrate their personal and professional engagement with anti-racist education. And again, the message is clear, both from the literature, but also from my professional experience, that we need a leadership orientation and practice that more explicitly focuses on anti-racism rather than the general framework of equity and social justice. And actually, I would argue that anti-racism should be the foundation of addressing other justice issues. And so we need leaders who are willing and able to engage in explicit discussions about race and racism, leaders who seek to understand whiteness, their own whiteness, the racial history of whiteness, and how whiteness is foundational in the inception of universities. But also, we need leaders who are able to examine their own assumptions, their own values and beliefs about what is education, what is the purpose of education, what is the purpose of a university, what is the contribution of university to community and to the world. And we need leaders who are able to explore their own biases, conscious and unconscious, who are able to consider the consequences of unequal power. And we need a leadership that's actually willing to process their own fears about the kinds of change that we're advocating for, because it's not only institutional policy, it is actual people who people these institutions. And so what can we do? And these are the same things that we're saying about public education. We need to hire more faculty of color, but not only hire them, but we need to retain them. We need to be compensated for the challenging work that we do. It's particularly when we teach on issues of race, anti-racism, colonialism, and whiteness. This is very, not only intellectually demanding, but it's also psychically, emotionally, and very difficult. And so in that regard, I have witnessed and experienced the misuse of teaching evaluations as a way to discipline and I would say in some cases harass. We need to actually support Indigenous and racialized faculty who are doing this work. And I know that there are faculty and students who are doing anti-racist, racial justice work who have been ignored, not valued, and our research and scholarship relegated to personal interest without acknowledgement of the relevance of our work to the institutions and to our broader society. And so when I think about my research and my teaching and my scholarship, it's always geared towards making change in the broader society. And one area, and I'm not keeping track of my time, but I would really like to speak about changes to core curriculum. And as already been mentioned, the need to create not only electives, but required courses, mandatory courses in anti-racism education, both at the undergraduate, but also at the graduate level. And that's one thing that I've noticed in our college. We have an undergraduate requirement, but then at the graduate level, there's nothing happening beyond maybe a multicultural unit in an existing course. And so, colleges of education prepare the next generation of educational psychologists, the next generation of educational administration, the next generation of curriculum writers. So I really see a glaring gap and shortcoming in terms of not only in colleges of education across the country. And so if we are about education, I really believe that that we need to change the curriculum, and that all subject areas need to look at how their subject area has a racial justice angle to it, and even though they may not see it as relevant. And just lastly, I would just say that we won't see change in the institution unless we have leaders who are able to see those the obvious racial inequities that exist. And we need leaders who are able to see, hear, talk about racial, cultural, and linguistic diversity within our institution. Thank you.
Thank you, Verna. I'll hand it over to Pam.
Thanks, Jennifer, and really powerful words from all three of you, Gaaya and Sunwoo and Verna. So difficult to follow, but I'd like to begin by saying that all university leaders are members of different communities. And, this is an obvious point, but sometimes I think we forget it. We're members of the university community, but we're also members of, families. We are members of, I'm a Japanese Canadian, and I'm committed to the Japanese Canadian community. I'm also a member of a research community. And, all of this makes up our whole selves, but we tend to compartmentalize ourselves. I think we do that far too often, so that we try to separate, the university administrator or the academic leader from the person who has a daughter, or the person who has a partner, who is very deeply committed to a body of to a certain type of research, and we have we want to uphold our moral values and principles in all of these spheres. And so I think it's most emotionally healthy to bring all of these different dimensions of ourselves together. And as we lead within universities, we need to think about our other kinds of loyalties and commitments, and just bring our whole selves. Authentic is a word that's often used now, especially in discussions of leadership, and I think it's now overused and misused, but I still think it's a good word. I think we need to bring our authentic selves to the position of dean or provost or president. And I don't think I'm unique in saying this. I think that faculty members, students, and staff all need to do this. I'd also say that it's impossible for me to, as a leader, as a dean, to step outside of my intersectional identity. I'm an Asian Canadian woman. I come from a working class family. And as Rabia, a former art student who's now studying at Columbia, um, said in an earlier panel, I believe it was a panel yesterday, she talked about intersectional identities. And she said that too often we are asked to abandon one identity and highlight another. And so we can't bring all of these identities with us when we enter a classroom, when we're in a boardroom, when we're being interviewed for a job. So I think it's really important to acknowledge this and to think about the ways in which universities pressure us or encourage us or even force us, coerce us, in the worst case scenario, to abandon some of our identities. And then about change within the institution. So in my current position, I have to work within the institution. And I heard some really, throughout the day yesterday and today in the forum, some really eloquent, passionate, intelligent, very insightful speakers talk about how perhaps we can't work within the institution, that we need more radical change. And I'm not saying that they are wrong whatsoever. There are many things that cannot be changed within the institution, but many elements of the institution can be changed. And it's not only, I think we're all tired of incremental change, very gradual change. I think we can make some radical changes within the university, but we have to know how to do that. And so we have to have a good knowledge of how universities work in order to do that. The bureaucracy, the policies, the procedures. I mean, these are very large bureaucratic organizations, administrative organizations, and we need to understand how to make change within them. And we also need to know about the different players, the different actors within universities, the things that a provost can do, the things that a president can do, a dean can do, and a department chair can do, and a regular faculty member can do, and importantly, what students can do. And often, especially over the last couple of years, you know, I've been approached by a number of students who have asked me to make changes. And I quite frankly say to them, I can't do that because that's not my jurisdiction, but you can. You can pressure me to do that. And then I can go to other offices within the university and say, this is what's been happening. The students are really concerned about this, and students do have a voice. So it's understanding, you know, how to work within the institutional framework. I think that's really, really important. I often say navigate the university system. And I guess the other thing I would talk about is the exercise of power. And contrary to popular belief, deans don't have absolute power. In fact, in some ways, they have very limited powers. And I would say the same thing about provosts and even university presidents. And we don't have complete power or total control because we have collective agreements, as we should. Most of us work in highly unionized environments. And so there are some things we'd like to do, but we can't because that would involve consultation with different parties. Not everyone would be in agreement. And I'm not saying, you know, the union wouldn't be in agreement, but I'm just saying it's a longer, more drawn out and yes, again, bureaucratic process. And we also work with governments, and as I can't remember who it was, someone earlier talked about the economics of universities, and students in another panel were also talking about universities being driven by economics and being very corporatist. So so there are all these constraints, and what we can do, however, is influence. I think in my role, I can influence people, and a provost can influence, and a president can influence. And I think that's where you're really able to make change, to influence faculty members, to influence students, people in departments as well. And I'm not really keeping track of time, so I don't know if I'm going over my limit. I can quickly go through a couple of other points.
Pam, sure.
Also...
Why don't you? I'm sorry, Pam. Oh. Why don't you take a couple minutes and wrap? Yeah, you're good. You're good. You can take a couple more minutes. Yeah.
Okay. I think it's really important for leaders, when they want to make change, to listen first. And that sounds like, oh yeah, we all know that, but we forget it, and people are really hasty. They want to just make a statement without taking time to listen to people. And again, Melanie Knight yesterday in a session said that as a Black woman, she's often offered, advice, help, support, but she can tell by the kind of support she's offered that they don't know what she needs, and they don't know her at all. And I think it's really important to listen to people, faculty, staff, but also students. And often we forget students within universities. Relationship building is very important. You have to earn people's trust. You just can't assume that they are going to trust you. And in fact, if you're a university administrator, they probably won't trust you. Something you have to work really hard on. And as a leader, you have to understand and respect differences within the academy. And as Verna said, that means rethinking what excellence is. That means rethinking our measures of success, and understand that different people will have different agendas. And you have to know how to work with different people with their different agendas so that no one feels left out. Lips don't just pay lip service. We know this. I've heard it throughout every session today. Rhetoric. People can see through. People are smart. They can see through rhetoric. Often money counts. So, and to effectively promote change, you must be able to allocate resources, whether that be money, staff, space, time. And leaders need to be able to get out of the weeds, to develop a vision for change, and to make time, because otherwise all the other demands of the job will just take up all of your time. And lastly, I know others, I want to give time for Jennifer, of course, facilitate the success of others. And I'm not an expert on Indigenous governance. I'm not an expert on Black studies, but I can support the people who are experts in these areas. So those are some of my suggestions. And I think I've merged all of your questions, Jennifer.
Okay, great. Thanks, Pam. And thanks to all the panelists. I'm going to get to the questions, but it struck me as I was listening to all four of you. So I had this memory of, I started thinking very carefully about my own whiteness and complicity with racism as a student, as a human being, during my master's degree work, which was about 30 years ago now. And I remember having this kind of like light bulb moment when I was learning about racism, the consequences of it to racialized communities, the violence of it, the extent of it, the depth of it. And I had this moment as a master's student where I thought, I'm so fortunate, white people are so fortunate that racialized and indigenous people talk to us at all. And because the depth of racism and the violence and the damage, both historically in the present, the levels at which it affects, it's mental and cognitive and spiritual and emotional and psychological, physical. So I guess I just have that memory, and I want to thank all of you. I'm just aware of my my own racial location right now, which is white, and it does feel like a gift, what the four of you have said. And I think it's just a reminder that, I guess for me anyways, I do feel fortunate to be in such rich conversations with racialized and Indigenous people, given the extent and the depth of racism and white people's complicity in that, and I'm sure sometimes my complicity as well. So thank you for your comments and thoughtfulness and just engaging in the conversation. So I started as the Provost Vice President Academic at Ryerson on July 1st. I've been in administration for about 10 years now, 12 years. I served as a faculty member for many years and taught courses. All of my research and teaching and leadership has had a focus on equity in different ways. So that's been a thread throughout my career in higher education. I do see it as a particular expectation or part of my role now as a provost. And I think I'll make a couple comments about how I see change. And then after, I'll be brief, and then I'll just let everyone know, then we'll go to the Q&A. So you can start thinking, if you haven't already, start thinking about questions for all of us or each of us. So I think in North America right now, a lot of universities are focusing on what we could call procedural and representational change. So procedural change is looking at policies and procedures to make sure they're equitable, that they are open to a variety of experiences, that they legitimize and affirm a variety of ways of knowing, of representing knowledge, of contributing to the profession or a community. And then another significant area of change is ensuring that in faculty and staff and student positions, that Indigenous and racialized groups are well represented. That faculty positions, for example, or students or staff, that when we look out at those groups, we see a wide range of people, including individuals from marginalized communities. I think both of those forms of thinking about equity are necessary and critical. I also think they're not enough. I think that universities need to think carefully about our responsibilities to life outside of the institution and to public life. And I think that, Sunwoo, I appreciated your comments about the kind of binary or dichotomy that those questions that I articulated set up between the university and community. And I guess what I would say is that that all of faculty work, university work of leaders has consequences. And if we're not clear about what those consequences are, if we're not clear about how our work, whether as a faculty member or an administrator, is supporting challenging the status quo, then in effect, we're reproducing the status quo. So all of us do work that matters, that has significance for public life. We don't get to opt out of that. So in addition to thinking about change in higher education that's related to procedures and the people in faculty positions and staff positions and our students, what groups those individuals come from, my thinking is that we must think about the consequences of our teaching, research, and creative work for public life, and whether our work challenges and resists the status quo or reinforces it. And I guess that's a significant piece. That belief or understanding of the role of higher education and the responsibilities of leaders has a lot of consequences, because it changes everything about what universities are for and what we're doing in the world. And so I'm glad to talk at more length about that. A question that accompanies that, though, is what capacities do students need to contribute to an equitable world? So in addition to thinking about the content in courses, that it could cover different experiences, different communities, different realities, that it could cover systems of oppression, intersectionality, that's certainly critical. We might also think about what capacities do students need to engage in considering equity in public life. What capacities do students need to think about power, to think about oppression, to think about systemic change once they graduate? And how are those capacities relevant to all graduates, regardless of faculty? So for me, if an institution has a commitment to equity, they're willing to think about the capacities that students graduate with and how those capacities will enable students, will allow all of us to think carefully about equity in universities and outside of universities. The other thing I'll say about change, and it relates to some of the earlier comments, is that it must be strategic. We are in large, complex institutions. There are many decision makers. There are many roles. We have various spheres of influence. So I'm always thinking about strategy. Who are the decision makers? What are the shared interests? Change often happens when there are some shared interests. Those can be difficult to identify, but identifying some shared interests will usually lead to more sustained and engaged forms of change. And I'm also interested in change that's systemic and sustainable. I'm not interested in short-term, kind of on the surface. That's not enough. And systemic and sustainable change will take time. It'll take a lot of time. So in closing, I thought I would just reflect on some of the challenges, just a couple, because some of your comments, that my earlier panelist comments, you know, I think as an administrator at the provostial level, it's a high, you know, I have a lot of influence, as Pam said, as you talked about what we can do, and I do have a lot of spaces where I can lend my influence. And I think, you know, I'm within a system that is inequitable in many ways. I'm white. I continue to obtain and enjoy and experience white privilege. Sometimes I see that. Sometimes I probably don't see that, how that privilege is working. And so I guess as a leader, I'm particularly attuned to and appreciative of colleagues, racialized and Indigenous colleagues who call me out when that's necessary. And you know, I mentioned Verna, I've known you for 10 years, so I just want to emphasize the importance for me of relationships where people do challenge me as a leader, as a human being, as a racialized person, as a person who experiences white privilege, so that my leadership is not a performance, that it doesn't emphasize or engage with dehumanizing euphemisms. It's a challenge to prioritize these commitments in universities, but it's necessary, and I'm really fortunate to be in this position and to have the engagement and support and friendship and collegiality of a lot of people here on this panel and otherwise. So I will wrap up there. I want to thank all the panelists again for the insights that you shared. I think we have the starting point for a really rich discussion, and I will now, I see one question in the chat. I'm assuming that everyone who's listening and participating knows how to forward along questions. So I will read this question out loud for everyone, and I'll just let the panelists know from the get-go that that this question is for all panelists. And I'm glad to go in any order that people would like. In fact, why don't I suggest that we start with the students, with Sunwoo and Gaaya, and then we can go from there. And the question for each of us is, what is the future of the university institution? What should this future look like rooted in radical changes?
Gaaya, do you have anything you'd like to say first? Or?
I can go first, if that's okay with you. Yes, thank you to whoever put in this question. And thank you to the other panelists for also sharing your input, because I think that also brings perspective into my answering of this question. I think, Pam, you made an excellent point in acknowledging the bureaucratic nature of the university. But I also think this is exactly why we need to recruit individuals, not as pawns or symbols of diversity, but as leaders who will sustain what we are talking about today and put it in the forefront of their vision for the university and their actual decision-making for the university. And so I think the future of the university lies in the hands of those who possess that space to decide that. And that goes to show why we have the responsibility at any moment to any individual to cultivate leaders that we can proudly allow to possess that space. And the radical changes or incremental changes alike, I don't think there's something that we should put aside for the future because they've been needed yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Thank you. I'll pass it to you, Sonu.
Yeah, thank you. This is a great question, and I was kind of brainstorming it while everyone was speaking, and I think one thing that I would love to see in like a dream university with radical changes is that the classroom looks radically different. And by that, I mean the physical structure of it, but also kind of how we think of the relation between instructor and student, and that power dynamic. I think right now, and it has been this way for as long as universities have existed, but that relationship between an instructor who deposits knowledge and pupils who obtain it and who must absorb it, I think that uneven power dynamic is kind of really central to the inequity that the university reproduces. And it's, I think, if the university were to reconsider that kind of core relationship, that core power dynamic that it relies on, it necessitates all kinds of other changes. Because then it's not only that these students are coming into the university who are fed through the public education system and come in and pay out of pocket or through loans to accumulate knowledge. It's people are coming here to collaborate with people who have been in these fields and share their own perspective and knowledge as well. Because I think we understand students kind of as blank and empty canvases right now, where that is just not the case, because they have lived and they have experience and knowledge to share as well, right? And I think that's where the whole flipped classroom like model comes from as well, where students have things to share. But even in those kind of marginal incremental changes to the system, the power dynamic is completely uneven. So if classrooms were, I think in a radically changed university institution, classrooms are much more collaborative, and inherently that dynamic of instructor and pupil is kind of broken down. I think I'll end it there.
Great. Verna or Pam, would either of you like to jump in?
Sure. Jennifer, could you just repeat the question?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So the question is, what is the future of the university institution? What should this future look like, rooted in radical changes?
Okay. All right. So I'm thinking about, faculty, and so the knowledge that they bring to their area. And I'm also thinking about research. And then I'm also thinking about empowering student engagement. And so I'll start with research. And I know that there's been a long distinction, at least historically, between pure, interesting the language, pure and applied research. And I have always been interested in applied research and in community-based participatory research. So always interested in how, thinking about, I think if we can begin to think about our research and how does that research promote or take into account racial justice? And because certainly we know that there's enough evidence of racial inequity, and so is there a way to prioritize or highlight those who are doing research to promote racial justice? And then in terms of hiring faculty, because where does it's kind of like, where do you start for change? Because if you don't have the faculty who can who can teach about racial justice in their graduate, and I'm really thinking graduate programming, then where does the change start? Because then what I've seen over 3 decades is that system just reproduces itself. Like you have another generation of new faculty renewal, and they have peripheral interest in justice. They know it matters, but it's not core. And so then they're engaged then in teaching the next generation of grad students. So it just never changes. It just carries on. And then they hire their people, and then they hire their people. And I've been on campus since in campuses in some capacity as student or faculty since 1978. And then the last thing is just hearing Pam talk about who can promote change, and you mentioned that there's a sphere of influence that you have as dean, but then also the role of student engagement in governance and in promoting change on campus. And I don't know that students hear that message enough and widely. I mean, there are students who get involved in, student organization and student union organizing. But I think if we can think about a way to explain what is the process, how does the university function, and what are the processes for promoting change. I don't know that students come into the university knowing that kind of information, and even knowing that they can have that kind of influence. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Verna. Pam.
I'll say that I'm grappling with the part of the question that asks about what a radically changed university would look like. But I'm thinking about the first part of the question. What I see as important changes within the institution, maybe not radical. Where does it start? And I'm thinking like Verna. I mean, faculty recruitment, and one of the reasons I say this is because, and I think Verna, you also mentioned this. If we want to change curriculum, and if we want to engage with students in different ways, we do have to open the university up to more faculty, different kinds of faculty members. And I'm thinking about, there have been many discussions about curriculum that addresses the histories and lived experiences of Indigenous peoples, about Black students, about Asian Canadian students. And when I think about the transfer of that knowledge, so if we do fundamentally reimagine, redevelop curriculum, who is going to impart that knowledge to the students? And if we are teaching Indigenous students, and this isn't my idea, this was brought up by I think it was the ethics of research session earlier today. Someone in that session raised this. If we have some mandatory courses on Indigenous history, Indigenous philosophy, and we don't recruit more faculty, is it going to be a white person who's going to be teaching those Indigenous students about their history? It's been very important for me to learn about my history, and I did that through my research as a Japanese Canadian. But would I want a white professor to be teaching me about intergenerational trauma, about the indispossession that took place to my people, to my community during the Second World War? I think that can be traumatic in itself. So that's why I think, faculty renewal, strategic thinking about faculty. And, there are lots of ways in which we could make radical changes, and it would have to be across the sector, most likely. And we'd have to think about funding, sources of funding, government. But I would say what for me would be a radical change is to think about students differently. To think about students. Some of us just forget about students, as I mentioned earlier. And I think we also need to think about how we can engage students, how we can prepare them. I think even in the humanities and social sciences, and maybe especially in the humanities and social sciences, we do prepare students for the world of work, for employment. But I think we also need to prepare them to be citizens, to be informed citizens, to live in a democracy. So I think that would be, if we could do that, and to understand where they are coming from, that would be radical for me.
Thanks, Pam. Yeah, I'll offer some brief thoughts, and then we do have one more question, and I think we have some time for that as well. So it's a great question. I have a kind of two-pronged answer, I guess. And one part of the answer is that I do believe in universities to be a place where I think universities can be a place where we do what I've talked about in my own work and writing as naming and imagining. So we can name what's wrong and listen to each other about different experiences of injustice, of racism, of oppression. And then we imagine a different future, and we figure out how to get to that future, how to practice a different set of relationships with each other and with institutions. And so I do believe that universities can offer a space to think about how we can live differently. In terms of what's radical, for me, I'm just going to use one part of the answer. It's not the only answer, and it's not the only thing that universities might be doing. But there's a definition of justice from a philosopher named Iris Marion Young. And she said that justice is when people can determine the conditions of their own lives. And I think if we had universities that focused on that, like how can the world be a place where people can determine the conditions of their own lives? How can education and programming help students and instructors think about that? How can research and creative work help us get closer to a world in which people can determine the conditions of their own lives? And that's a start of an answer to. I think if we could think about the academic work at universities as at least considering that question and what it means and how we could orient ourselves to that conversation and that set of practices, that for me would be radical and could inform all kinds of things that would introduce changes at universities. Let me go to the second question. We have just under 5 minutes, and I think people probably are aware that the stop time is a hard stop time. So I'll make sure as moderator that I'll try to make sure that no one gets cut off. And maybe before I jump into the question, I'll say again how much I appreciated the panelists' contributions and the questions, and all of you who are attending and listening to our comments. Thanks for coming. And I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. So if I'm unable to offer kind of concluding comments, I've done that a little bit now. The second question here is, and it's for anyone, how can we more effectively hold leaders accountable for making anti-racist decisions that shape the university and its future? How can we make this as clear and prioritize a metric as something like the financial health of the institution? So how can we hold leaders accountable for making anti-racist decisions, and how can we identify clear metrics for that? And again, I'll give Gaaya and Sun Woo, and maybe I'll just ask everyone to be quite brief, anyone who wants to jump in on this question. Sun Woo or Gaaya, did you want to comment on that question at all?
For me, I think I'm more interested in hearing the perspectives of the university leaders themselves. So I'll pass it off to Sun Woo in case he has something else to say.
Thanks, Gaaya.
Yeah, I was actually in the same boat. I guess one thing I'll comment on quickly is the idea that we need to make it a clear and prioritized metric. I think the only thing that would matter is actual material change for the students and the faculty who are experiencing this discrimination right now. And I don't think any numbers or spreadsheets or anything will do anything to to affect that change until that actual change is made. But I guess to the leaders in the university here, in terms of how leaders can be held accountable, I would ask if you can think of times that you have been challenged and deeply troubled, and your worldview as a leader has been deeply shaken by people who have kind of tried to keep you accountable or called you out or kind of checked in on things that you were doing as a leader.
Yeah, thanks, Sunwoo. That's a great question. So we've got just 2 minutes. Pam or Verna, do you want to jump in?
Well, I'll just say I think it's a really important question, and these are the kind of questions that we need to have asked more often and more widely. And I think that I guess in the academy we're not too used to saying we've been wrong, and that we have like actually owning that is a first step. And because there's always like an effort to move on or to have like smooth it over. And so really, I guess being honest about the challenges that we face and the inequities that are experienced on campus. And that's a question and an issue, I guess, that I'm trying to understand myself.
Okay,
Well,
thank you, Verna.
I'm intrigued by Sunwoo's question, but I don't fully understand it, so I may not answer that one. How are we held accountable? I think not by words and committees, but by outcomes and impact. Yeah,
I think it's actually a good question to kind of leave all of us with, or maybe just leaders. I won't speak for everyone else, but the kind of what are we accountable to? When have we been shaken, and how can we rethink what we're doing? So I'm just looking at the clock. We've got about 10 seconds. So I want to thank everyone again for participating, and I think it's going to literally cut us off in about 10 seconds. So it's a great question, I think, to end with, and thanks to everyone again for your participation in today's panel. All right.
Thanks to all of you.
Record the data.
Record the data. So I think we're still here in the room.
Oh, yeah. Oh. Like I would say, are we on? No, we've.
I think we're. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure, but my understanding is that the clock is 0. So I think we're.
Okay.
Yeah,
well,
I don't know for sure.
I just
we have 5 minutes.
Yeah,
so I'm sorry. Let me clarify, Verna. We have 5 minutes left. The clock is now it's reset, so we've got 5 minutes left. So please, Verna, and if anyone else wants to jump in, we may have time for that. Go ahead, Verna.
And I'd love for Sunwoo to say more about that question. I'd love for Sunwoo to explain the question.
Yeah,
I think Verna, Verna, please go first.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I mean, if we're going to have metrics, then I think we have to keep data on what happens to students, and if that data is already kept, or how many people are denied tenure and promotion. And it seems like there's a reluctance to collect that kind of, I would say, race-based data. But then there must be data kept on, student attrition and how students do in university, or how long students of color take to complete graduate programs. Just that kind of data. I think if you're going to assess the success of a university, you have to have like that base information. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Verna. Sunwoo, maybe you can give us more thinking about your question.
Yeah. Well, first, I think, Verna, you're absolutely right. And I think the reason I was so, I guess, dismissive of data and kind of metrics was that often universities undertake these data collecting and researching kind of projects, collect that data, and then that data information and that really useful critical information just sits in a document, and that document ends up standing for the anti-racist work that the university did. rather than affecting material change. So I think that's where my kind of wariness with the metrics comes from. As for my question, I just meant to kind of ask you, Pam, and you, Jennifer, kind of about times where you were doing leadership work and someone pushed back on kind of the things that you were trying to introduce, or kind of the changes that you were trying to make. And that kind of shifted the way you think about things and kind of shook a deep thing that you believed that you were doing was good, but might have been like wrong or the wrong approach or something like that. And then I guess I would say that like to reflect on those moments in your career would be really useful in trying to see what kind of other changes you could implement in the future as well, because then you'd have like a kind of a frame of reference for where to go. I don't know if I'm making sense.
If I could really quickly add to this, because I feel like I share the same sentiment as some. I think that students, and I know I'm not completely dismissing students either, because in some capacities we can be leaders as well, but sometimes we feel really like fatigued if we try to call in with university leaders, because a lot of things just get lost in emails or meetings, and things just don't end up like getting communicated properly. So I think if we could use like the little time that we have left for you to tell us how you want to be called in and how you want to be held accountable by your students, I think that would probably be a good note for us to end this on.
I can just say quickly, I want to be held accountable, but I also want support. And what really was devastating to me was when someone said that I was obsessed with equity, with anti-racism work, or EDI, that fundamentally shook my worldview, because I thought that's part of our moral responsibility as a university, and I don't think that prevents me from doing all the other work. So I would love for, and I have been getting the support of students telling me, please do this anti-racism work. Jennifer?
Yeah, it's just 10 seconds. So how students can call us in is make clear requests, tell us what you need, ask for conversations, like clear requests. We get a lot of emails, so clear requests are helpful. I think we're at time now. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if, I frankly don't know if others can hear us. Is Patrick on the call now? Are we done? Yeah, okay. I guess we can hear each other. 6:05. Yeah. Okay. But Patrick, can okay.